You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our final week discussing Overture to Death by Ngaio Marsh, all the way to the end of the story. All spoilers are on the table. And Herds,
Flex,
I feel like you've come away pretty well from this one, all things considered.
this novel has a lot of wacky stuff going on. It's kind of bizarre how our killer has like a less complex mystery than the other villain in the story who gets away scot-free, which is very strange to me.
As you pointed out in like the first couple of weeks that we've been talking about the novel, one of the things that's really obvious about this book is that it is sort of trying to be a parody, but it is so far back in the genre's history that it doesn't read as parody unless you go into it looking for that, I guess.
Maybe it felt like parody at the time it was written, but because there's so much space-time between now and when it was written, it's like, well, it's just another Queen of Crime Golden Age novel, right? Like
Exactly.
It's part of that pantheon.
We have all of these silly things, especially when we start to get towards the character motivations for our main two villains you're describing. It's like one of them is so cartoonish that it's like, how did this get through to the keeper? But that's also kind of the point.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, I guess we're in full spoilers mode. The killer, as I assessed last time on the show, it's Miss Prentice.
I'm shocked.
I know, right? The story more or less played out in, at least for Miss Prentice side of things, in the structure. Because when I presented my first theory, right, I presented it as, oh, well, obviously we're going to have the debate about which character was the intended target. I definitely thought that we were going to lean more on my second theory, that we were going to try and pin it on the two young lovers. But again, as we were kind of talking about last week, we end up so chummy with all of the characters except for the two criminals that it can't be anybody else. It has to be either Celia Ross or Miss Prentice, because they're the only characters who are not telling the truth in a way that is fun. Because Henry and Dina, they don't want to talk about when they met Miss Prentice in the lane, but he talks with such obvious charisma that we're kind of meant to ignore it. We're not really supposed to suspect him in any serious way.
For all of the supporting cast of this novel, I feel like so much of it is through Henry's lens that there's no way that they could have really gotten any real depth out of him doing anything without introducing an unreliable narrator that I feel like this book wasn't willing to really work with.
Well, there was the alternate option of making Dina the killer and having it be Henry realizes that even the person he loves the most can be the killer. But we kind of have that moment where he realizes, I mean, he kind of doesn't get on with his dad, but he sees his dad being taken in by Celia Ross. She's trying to seduce him, succeeds in seducing him. And so, you know.
One of the really interesting things hearing you say that is that I can't refute the idea that Dina could have been the killer in this alternate telling of the story, but also this book story just feels so genre boundly inevitable. As you were saying that, I'm like, no, that couldn't happen. No, there's no way in hell.
It would definitely be ahead of its time to have Dina turn out to be the killer for some reason.
Any reason other than what they give Miss Prentice.
Other than religious fervor? I mean...
Religious fervor,
yeah.
And the H word.
Yes. I'm glad you're the one to bring it up this time, but it's just frustrating because I feel like it was only like early this year, late last year, that I really started hammering on books that lean into madness in general is obviously distasteful, but the H word in particular is particularly gross after myself having gone down a psychology research hole on the origins of the word. It's hysteria. Let's just make it clear. Let's say the quiet part out loud. Because obviously that word itself, it's just a word, but Miss Prentice doesn't have any agency after she commits the crime. She kind of sequesters herself away in her room. She doesn't eat anything. She doesn't participate in the mystery in any meaningful way. And then when she's caught, she laughs like a crazy person because that's what she's supposed to be. And we don't see her again.
This is one of the troubles of reading back in history, is that it is so hard to gauge what part of what you have just described is meant to be the obviously aspired for parody. Because having Miss Prentice be so bound up by madness isn't really funny to read at least to me. But also, like, I don't know how plausible or outrageous Ngaio Marsh was aiming for this to be. And based on her other work, and particularly the, like, bravado masculinity that Roderick Alleyn has a reputation for, my inclination is to expect the worst.
I don't think that I could deliver a judgmental hammer blow from above to this novel, but you definitely do want to sort of interrogate, why is this a female-coded crime setup? Because that's the other thing that might have been obvious there, but like, it's not just the villains that Alleyn doesn't really trust. It's the two women who have any presence at all in the story, right? Or I guess the three, if you count Miss Campanula, but she's dead. All the men he gets along with, and thus, you know, they're not the killer. And then all the women he doesn't, or he ignores, basically.
I mean, and he even walks in and he's like, oh, this is a women's crime, man.
Yes, he does.
It's just like, okay, Roderick,
yes.
whatever you say, bro.
A woman would replace a water pistol with a gun and stick it inside a piano.
Yeah, because women are, of course, the most like Georgie Biggins, the young child.
The most childish and
just,
emotional.
What are we doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, again, I'm not going to completely condemn the book for these things, but it is worth kind of noting that there's these weird gender stereotypes that are working their way in.
The other thing that was sort of missing from the way that the crime wraps up too is that so much of the setup of the novel is like, oh, we're trying to fund this and we're trying to fund that, and here is this interest and that interest that all of these characters have. And in the end, it comes down to love and money, shock and horror in the genre of murder mystery, I know.
Yeah, right.
But I don't feel like we ever quite get the conclusion to several of the threads. Like, why was Celia Ross, you know, willing to throw all the money to do this play in particular? Characterization, I guess, but...
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was part of the long con, because she's revealed to be a criminal. She reads to me like a character who's going to come back in a future book, but she seems like a character that Ngaio Marsh was saying, well, now I have this, like, disguise-wearing inverse Sherlock Holmes who can sit on the council of murder suspects and, you know, really dig her claws into whatever plot that I want to throw her at. Because, yeah, she puts the money towards the play and she brings all those pieces of furniture in. So she's clearly flaunting her criminal wealth. But to be completely fair, there is some nuance in that she seems to be falling for her mark. As the trope kind of goes, she's falling for Templeton, although she is still willing to throw him under the bus to not be caught, basically.
I don't think that character comes back, but to my mind, the specific difference here is that the sort of portrayal that an author sees a character as an actor is sort of thematic that we've discussed, where, like, the same archetype will appear in a different story, but like in the author's head, maybe it's a very similar person showing up. I mean, I'll talk a little bit with Gabriel Bergmoser in an interview that you'll hear in this episode about how these archetypes do start to kind of roll through in an author's thing, and especially in the very theatrical sense that both he and Ngaio Marsh sort of come from. It's really interesting seeing how those character frameworks provide so much of the, like, thrust for how stories develop. For all of its many failings in terms of not quite ever feeling like the story is completely wrapped up, the actual staging and theatrics of that finale, it's beautiful. You know, as you were talking about, the dirge plays, the curtain comes up, they basically do what feels like a rock opera number to be like, it was you, Miss Prentice.
We've caught you. Bomb, 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 and they get her.
And she, like, rises with the curtain as it comes up and, like, points the... It's so good.
Yeah, it's pretty good on that note. Celia Ross, I thoroughly enjoy the way that the book just rips her to shreds, because she thinks, oh, Alan, he's a much kinder detective than everybody else here. He's wearing plain clothes. So I'll take my story to him and try and earn some brownie points with him. And by the end of the conversation, he's turned everything she said on its head and exposed her for exactly what she is, and exactly what she's saying is false. And she says, like, I should have talked to Mr. Fox, shouldn't I? And Alan kind of is like, yeah, you should have talked to anybody but me, you buffoon. I love that moment.
Yeah. I suppose we should move on. We're going to have a chat with Gabriel Bergmoser about his latest fiction release, The Hitchhiker, which has finally made its way to the page from audiobook. And then we'll be back to talk about the mystery of Overture to Death, or lack thereof. This Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour. Stick around. More to come. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and I am delighted to be joined by Gabriel Bergmoser. He's a Melbourne-based author and playwright, and joins us in the studio to talk about his latest, I guess, page release, although not latest, piece of fiction, The Hitchhiker. Gabriel, welcome to Death of the Reader. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
The first thing that people should know about this is this was originally an Audible piece of fiction that you put out, and you're now revisiting it as it's getting a print edition. What was the journey like between the initial kind of writing of this for audiobook through to where we are today?
It was tangled, as you know, that transition would imply. But effectively what happened was that in 2020, I had a book out called The Hunted, which was quite a big hit for me. And that was an outback horror thriller type thing. So around the same time, I'd spoken to Audible about doing a couple of original novellas for them. And they said that they would sign me up for 2 straight away off the bat if one of them could be this sort of outback horror type story. And because I'm a working writer and I need to eat, I immediately said yes, despite having no real idea for it. And then had to develop the idea from there. Now, because it was going to be outback again, generally speaking, I don't think any author likes repeating themselves, but because The Hunted had been this sort of high-octane, all-night siege story set in the outback, I had to make this something different. I thought, let's go small, let's go contained, let's go 2 people in a car, let's go Hitchcock rather than Tarantino, basically, was my approach. And as I wrote the book, I kind of finished it and thought, this isn't just a novella. I'm like, this is 100% my next novel. And Audible responded really well to it, and they got behind it. They did a huge promotion of it in 2022, which meant that it ended up being at #1 for a month in Australia, which was insane. It's like the only time in my life I think I'm ever going to be ahead of both J.K. Rowling and Stephen King in the top 10 chart. And it's purely because of the promotion they did. But, I'll take the technicality win 100%. But there was always that slight disappointment that it didn't have its place on the shelf with the other books. And I sort of sneakily said to Harper Collins, well, I've got this thing called The Hitchhiker. And luckily enough, they really liked it and they were happy to get behind it. And they saw how it has some crossover characters and some connections to the other books. So it's very gratifying to kind of finally, see it having its place on the shelf, because I really think it deserves it. And the response so far would bear that out, I think.
Especially because like The Caretaker, The Hitchhiker, and I think The Lodger is the upcoming one featuring sort of our first character we meet in this particular story. That's an idea that you've clearly kind of grown attached to in some ways. What was it that made that stick out to you as something you wanted to revisit through those other 2 stories?
The whole idea of a character who is Ted Lasso but a serial killer is just so enticing to write about and just so much fun. And, that character I enjoyed so much that I took him over into The Caretaker. And then Audible signed me up for a sequel very quickly after The Hitchhiker came out, which is The Lodger, which is coming out in October. And hopefully we'll also get a print release, so this sort of unofficial trilogy can have its place on the shelf. But it was just the fact that you don't often come across characters like that, like characters that feel so fully formed and they feel so complete and they feel like you don't really ever have to think about what they're saying next because they're already saying it.
Yeah.
And I just straight away knew that there was more mileage in him. And I will say very clearly, his story is wrapped up in The Lodger. There won't be any more of him past that book. Because I sort of got to a point where I was like, at what stage does it become diminishing returns? At what stage is it Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan?
Well, exactly, because one of the things that you said about, I think the particular word you used for him was avuncular serial killer, is the way that he is like this superhuman that is very mundane but frightening in being so.
Absolutely. And I think my biggest influence for that is the Hannibal Lecter franchise. And Brian Fuller, who was the showrunner of the TV show, which is one of my all-time favorite shows, he always used to say that he wanted to write the show in a way where there were always 2 interpretations you could have of his Hannibal at any one time. So, for example, Hannibal Lecter gets into a room he's not supposed to be in. Well, do you believe he's the devil, or do you believe he's a very intelligent human? If he's the devil, he turned into smoke and went under the door. If he's a human, he picked the lock. Yeah. But the show itself is never going to answer which of those is true.
Which is such a classic murder mystery
100%.
thing to do, right?
And so that's kind of my logic with this character, where this character in particular is potentially mildly supernatural, because there are a couple of points in both this and The Caretaker, and will be in The Lodger as well, where, he knows things he shouldn't know, or he gets out of situations he shouldn't get out of, or he survives things he shouldn't survive. And my approach to that was, as long as I know in my head what the logical, realistic answer to how that was done is, I can get away with not explaining it, because I kind of like leaving the open door. I think it does create this sort of, is he like the devil a little bit.
Like, the potential is just as powerful as the answer,
100%,
if not more.
100%.
And I think one of the other things that's really interesting, connecting back to that idea of classic mystery, is that so much of the way that you structure the story, particularly in The Hitchhiker, is sort of micro mysteries. Like, we have throughout the entire book these short 50-page mysteries that are getting answered bit after bit after bit that sort of drag you through such a short time frame with so many different questions, and it seems like such a juggling act to get all of that in there, right?
Well, I mean, I've got to kind of harken back to Thomas Harris and Hannibal Lecter here, because when I'm doing workshops with aspiring writers, one exercise I'll often get them to do is to write an opening line that will grab people's attention. And, people always go for like, the bomb went off or whatever, or, something huge. And I always bring up the fact that my favorite ever opening line of any book is the opening line of Red Dragon, which is Will Graham sat Jack Crawford down on the bench by the sea and gave him a glass of iced tea, which is one of the most mundane opening lines you can imagine. But the brilliant thing about that opening line is that because it gives you no context whatsoever for who these men are, no description, no nothing, it just announces them as if you should already know who they are. You can't help yourself. You read the next line. You automatically go, I've got to read the next line. And the next line is, you don't want to talk about it here, Crawford said. I don't want to talk about it anywhere, Graham said, but you've got to talk about it, so let's talk about it. Well, now you're going to read the next line. And the brilliance of that is that with every new line or paragraph, Harris is introducing another question. It might be a question as small as, who are these guys? But it gives you no chance to stop and decide whether you're bored or not. And by the time you get to the end of that first chapter, some of the questions have been answered, but so many others have been introduced that you're going to keep reading. And that, to me, is the structure of any good thriller, where you've got to start out creating what Stephen King always calls the gotta, make audiences ask certain questions, and then introduce more questions as the new ones get answered, like little fish hooks that you keep kind of putting in until hopefully you've got enough in there that they're going to keep turning the pages till the end.
And I think one of the other interesting things too about the way that you talk about that and the way that you write is that it seems like your stories have a very different relationship to spoilers to a lot of your peers. The way that you structure out stories and the way that it comes around those concepts of, like, Maggie reflecting on the way that she is almost in response to Paul in this book, and the way that Jessie reflects her journey, and all of these characters bouncing off each other, that means that there's just this different level of things to discover in the way that you write in these kind of micro mysteries we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one with spoilers, because I suppose if you're an author of whodunits, which I'm not, but I suppose I will be with this new one.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, well, I think in general, like, obviously you don't want to give the game away, and you do want readers to experience certain things cold. On the other hand, again, I take my cues a bit from Brian Fuller here, because I remember when the second season of Hannibal was coming out, and this was back before the AV Club became crap, but he would do a weekly interview with the AV Club after every single episode, and it would be this deep dive into minutiae of every single episode. And because I was a fan of the show and I was a fan of the entire Lecter property, I would read all these interviews every week. The moment the episode was finished, I was sitting there refreshing the website, waiting for the interview to come up. And I was always taken aback by how arbitrary he was with spoilers. Like, he would just openly spoil what was going to happen 3 episodes down the line. It was never so overt as to say character X is going to kill character Y or whatever it might be. But it was enough that if you were a close watcher of the show, you could read between the lines, easily pick it up. But the thing that struck me was that it didn't spoil my experience at all. So to me, when it comes to discussing spoilers, because there are so many things that can characterize spoilers, but I'm a bit in general annoyed by spoiler phobia. Like, yeah, there are certain things I want to talk around, I want to protect. But generally speaking, even the thing about the driver being a killer, yeah, that's a twist, but if you've read The Caretaker, no, it's not. And if you've read the first quarter of this book, it's not. So, like, does it count as a spoiler if it happens in the first quarter of the book? Like, I don't think you can be that precious about it.
We've spoken on the show about all sorts of things, like, the whole Penn and Teller, like, showing the trick can be as cool as the trick idea and all that. But one of the ones that was really interesting with your book in particular is we often talk about on the show this idea of book 1 and book 2, that crime fiction in particular, because of its dependence on twists and mysteries, has the book that you read before you know the truth and the book that you read after you know the truth. And one of the things that's so fascinating about your book is that I feel like it's the first crime fiction book I've read that I almost can't view with that lens, because of the structure and the way that it's paced out in these little micro mysteries. There's questions that you learn, but they only reframe so far back in the book, but in a way that actually I think works really well because it's constantly offering things to the audience in return.
I really, really like hearing you say that. Like, for example, I don't think the film stuck the landing, but I loved going to see Barbarian recently, and going in thinking it was going to be one thing, and then 20 minutes into the film, it pivots in a totally different direction. I was like, oh, we're off the reservation. Like, I don't know what's going on now. And that was kind of what I wanted to do with The Hitchhiker. So it's not as simplistic as, I don't want to say simplistic because I don't think that trick is a simplistic one to pull off, but it's not, there's a book before you know and a book after you know. There's several books going on, and there's several layers to this, and there's several things to know, and several.
It's like a little candy jar of little questions that you just get to pick out.
So that's kind of what I was going for. So if I hear that lands, that's a really lovely thing to note.
Well, I certainly think it did. And Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us on Death of the Reader. It has been a delight talking with you and getting to dive into The Hitchhiker on the Page.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
This is Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour here on 2SER 107.3. We'll be back with more in just a second. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our final week, our final discussion, Herds, of Overture to Death by Ngaio Marsh.
We're going to talk about how the mystery is bizarre and strange and mechanically barely there, but still a fun time.
The thing that I like about this book, and the thing that I liked about Michael Tearawa Bennett's books, and the thing that I've tended to just gravitate towards this year, is books that give away too much because they're kind of confident that there's enough else going on. And I think this book gets the closest to mistaken confidence. But I still like the way that the book is generous with its clues to set more of a scene, you know?
I do enjoy that there is a lot of detail to how our culprit actually invented the crime, sort of came up with it, right? Because we've got this conga line of characters who kind of put the idea in our head, like, oh, Miss Campanula plays this same song every time. And then, oh, Georgie Biggie Boy.
Georgie Biggins.
You know, he's playing chopsticks on the piano or whatever.
Biggie Smalls, as we called him.
There's a timeline in this book. I don't care to remember it. I'm sorry. I don't particularly care about what point the pot plants went onto the piano.
One of the weirdest sequences in this book is when they, like, try and establish the alibis for everyone when the trap must have been set up. And the scenes that they create is basically like, oh, and then we have this group shot of everyone walking away from the church, and this group shot of everyone walking away from the church. And it kind of felt like waiting outside the back of a theater for the actors to come out after a Broadway show. Just like too many people waiting there for too little to go on. Like they just want to get home after a day's work. Why do we have to have these weird interrogatory conversations? It's not creating tension, it's just creating discomfort.
I definitely felt like there was a bit of noise in that regard because it's The Onion, isn't it? You can pinpoint the clues that are actually important to solving the mystery so easily because they repeat them so often. And then there's all these discussions around like there was a squeaky gate and the French window and the phone being out, which actually was a clue that I didn't really understand last week, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the other weird ones too is that in those series of vignettes of characters heading home from the church, there's this moment where they very obviously pull Miss Prentice's alibi out from under her, only to give her a new alibi a couple of scenes later. And it sort of makes it more obvious by the doing and undoing of the alibi.
I mean, I just looked for the part where she cackled like a hen and flew away. You know, I felt like that was enough evidence to the contrary of any sort of alibi. They do create a pretty ironclad alibi of we were all together the whole time, except for this one time where Miss Prentice went away, which, you know, singles her out, obviously. But I did appreciate that I had to think a little bit about, you know, what time did Miss Prentice have to actually put the gun in the piano or to get the gun from the study. But a lot of those details, again, don't really matter. As I said, I think The Onion was probably the clue that I most enjoyed peeling apart. They mention over and over again, they're like, she never cries. She cried this one time, and so we took her seriously. And then they talk about how there's an onion in a teapot. It's like, that's very strange. I think that might be one of my favorite clues in the novel.
There is also this like sort of, I guess in the modern context, like point and click video game adventure vibe where Alan gets so many of the clues by like walking into a space and just seeing an object and suddenly the truth is apparent.
Well, I think for him it's more, oh, that's out of place. I should put that into my pocket for later. And then later on he can combine the onion with the handkerchief damp with tears, and that's how he figures out the mystery.
It is a mystery I am perplexed by, but not for want of its answers. It is not a difficult one to solve, but it also doesn't seem like it's trying to be difficult to solve, but it also spends a lot of time pretending like it is trying to be difficult to solve. And weirdly, I think all in all that it works. It has this aura where you're along for the ride, getting to see Alan have more of those character interactions, especially as you were talking about with Celia Ross when she walks up and tries to put him on side and she realizes it was a horrible mistake. That is a fantastic sequence that has so little to do with the mechanics of the mystery, but just reads really well.
To some degree, I wish that Celia Ross was our murderer, because I think she's just a much more well-rounded, well-written character. Like, Miss Prentice has her place, but she's more of a device than a character in a lot of ways, which is a shame.
Well, and the other thing that's strange about her being a villainous woman is that so much of this crime revolves around, like, Dr. Template and everyone's, you know, as you say, religious fervor and wants to hold the power in the village. But, like, weirdly, even though the murder victim is a woman and the crime is perpetrated by a woman and our main character is, like, I guess, Henry, as he becomes the next generation of detective, so much of this book feels like it's happening to men in a way.
So you can read literally the last page of the book. I've been going back on how to kind of talk about this, but Alan has this like final quote. It's not the very last line in the book, but it might as well be. He says that if you could send every grand passion to the laboratory, we would find something of Dina and Henry's young ideal, something of Template's infatuation, Miss P's madness, and even something of old Jerningham's foolishness. They've left out Ross there, but what is kind of happening here? So Dina and Henry are the lovers. They're kind of secondary to Alan. Henry is essentially a protagonist, while Dina is the subject of his infatuation. Two women are villainous, and then Template, Jerningham, and the Rector are all idiots, right? That's the characterization. So I should be fair here. The men, the adult men, let's be clear, also have an interesting blanket characterization where even where Ngaio Marsh is trying to like separate them here as having infatuation and foolishness and the religious thing.
It's all some layer of incompetence,
It's
right?
some layer of incompetence. And that's fun, you know, in detective novels. That's what a lot of the policemen exhibit and characters in authoritative positions, which is kind of what all these men are, right? As the doctor, the constable, and the rector. But it is interesting that all three men, they end up, as you say, having the plot done to them by the villainous women in the story. You could argue that Henry and Dina represent the idealized man and woman.
Yes. No, I think that's a fair reading.
I'm glad we're on the same page. Just to like round out that thought, because I don't want people to think I'm saying that, you know, all the men and all the women, but all the adult men and all the women are either foolish or villainous, right? And clearly Ngaio Marsh wishes more people to be Dina and Henry. And Henry wants to be Alan. So, you know, just to be clear about what Ngaio Marsh wants here, she wants more Allens in the world and people turning into Alan.
I think, all in all, it is a worthwhile read if you're going through Ngaio Marsh's back catalogue. This is a great example of a book that is interesting because of its failings. And that's something especially of the Golden Age authors that I just find fascinating, that you read things that they wrote and there's just something a little bit ticklish about what they've done. But I get so much mileage out of that.
What's the fun in reading a perfect book? You know, you got to read arguably the worst books, you know, to truly appreciate the crumbs of genius.
We have 2SER's Radiothon for the next couple of weeks on the show, so we'll be joining you live to just hang out, play some tunes, and talk a little bit about the world of community radio. But once we return on our third next show, we're going to be taking a little bit of a break to join our editor, Cameron Furlong, host of the new podcast Inquiry, to watch a Bong Joon-ho film called Memories of Murder.
my goodness. So we wish him all the best with his new amazing show. And yes, we're watching Memories of Murder, which is a 2003 South Korean neo-noir crime thriller film directed by Bong Joon-ho.
You might know Bong Joon-ho for Parasite or Snowpiercer.
I was going to say, that name sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Here we are. It's going to be great.
It should be a really good fun time. We will catch you then. Happy Radiothon to all of you. This is Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour. We're out of here.
Woo.